Good morning, everybody. I think we're all set to go. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for what will be a very interesting chat on some of the lessons that we can take away from COVID-19. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nick Hodges. I'm the General Manager of our Corporate and Specialty Division at Austbrokers Corporate. We're very lucky this morning to have with us today Dan and David from RiskLogic. For those of you that don't know RiskLogic, RiskLogic is a leading provider of resilience services for the public, private and not-for-profit sectors across Australia and New Zealand. RiskLogic's been working with a number of clients through each phase of COVID-19, including undertaking a significant number of crisis response debriefs to support learning and growth in organisational resilience. The team has worked across a number of different clients across multiple sectors, including aged care, telecommunications, food and beverage, retail, finance and property. Despite that broad sector of industries, there are some common trends across all. So Dan and David are going to, walk us through those with a view of helping your business continuously improve its resilience maturity. Quick, intro to Dan and David. Firstly, Dan Shields. Dan is the CEO and founder of RiskLogic. He leads the consulting division and the client service delivery across the business and has worked with hundreds of organisations over the years, from SMEs to large multinationals and all levels of government. David Gumley. David is the head of growth at RiskLogic. He's responsible for the commercial value and engagement impact of RiskLogic's client service offering. He's got over 20 years experience leading growth agendas within professional services firms. He's worked with a number of markets across Europe and Asia Pacific. Before we get going, I just want to cover off a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, we suggest that you turn off all your other programs and apps, whether you're on a PC, a laptop or an iPad, just to help with your bandwidth speed. We've deactivated everybody's camera and microphone, just so you can simply focus on the presentation and the presentation materials. You'll have the ability to ask questions through the session. You'll see at the top right of your screen, there'll be a Q&A tab. You can simply just click on that or tap on that if you're on an iPad and just key in your questions, and we can address those through the session. We're also going to have a couple of polls as we go through the session. Both the questions and the polls will be anonymous. The presentation itself will probably go for about 30 to 40 minutes, so we'll leave plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. We will address questions, as I said, through the session. But if there's any more, we can certainly tackle those at the end. And finally, if you do miss anything, and for those that haven't been able to attend today, we'll have a recording of the session so we can get that out to all attendees, and we'll probably put it out on LinkedIn as well. So with that, I'll now hand across to David to get us started. So thanks, David.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The events which have unfolded this year have challenged each and every one of us in ways which we've not experienced in living history. The pressures from COVID-19 has tested the resilience of organisations, governments, and the very social fabric of our communities. So RiskLogic, we've been working and supporting clients through each phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, including undertaking a significant number of crisis response debriefs to support learning and growth in organisational resilience. Our team has worked with clients within residential aged care, telecommunications, food and beverage, manufacturing, retail, finance and property groups. And despite the variety of industries, common trends in crisis response have emerged from those. So within today's webinar, we are going to share some key insights from the COVID-19 debriefs that we have conducted, with a view to assisting your organisation to continuously improve its level of maturity in organisational resilience. So I'll now hand over to Dan, who will take us through some of those insights.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David and Nick, and welcome to everybody today. I know everybody's time is precious, lots to do, so to put this time aside, we do appreciate that. And the objective today is to take you through some elements there that will hopefully enable you to take some learnings back to your own organisations. Maybe ask some questions about where you're up to, where some of the challenges might exist. You may have already done a debrief. You may already have learnings from your own experiences. A message I give to executives, and I have been for many months now, is that everybody's experience of COVID has been unique. every organisation, depending on who you are, the sector you're in, the geographic location you operate from, we've all experienced the impacts of COVID in special ways, and everybody will have some common themes, but also some very unique elements in terms of what that response and those impacts look like. So what I'd like to do as a starting point is talk about the threat environment. I think context is always so important in terms of understanding how you can strengthen your resilience as an organisation. But also what I'd like to talk about today is not just the organisational resilience, but that of key personnel. And we think about leadership teams. Your role as leadership teams is very much about guiding and steering an organisation through the worst of times. And I think it's fair to say we've been through those this year. But that resilience is so important, coming together as a leadership team and be able to provide that strategic response. So when we look at the threat environment, there are some key trends that we've seen leading into COVID, but also through that. And I think one of the most important ones that I'm sure you'll agree with is just how quickly the environment is changing. Rapid change with significant uncertainty. Now, we were saying this well before COVID hit because we were seeing some fairly major events taking place, impacts from drought and various other geopolitical situations leading into COVID. And of course, COVID has just exacerbated the rate of change and the amount of uncertainty that people are experiencing. The other one that we're seeing as well is, prior to COVID, there was there was minimal focus on what we call high impact, low probability events. Now, these are the things that you don't expect to happen, but if they do happen, they're going to cause massive, impacts. And COVID has certainly been one of those. But in saying that, COVID should have always been, or pandemic should have been on those risk registers as an event that could have occurred. Our medical authorities and experts have been saying that it was just a matter of time before we saw a major global pandemic. This is not the first time it's happened, as I'm sure we're all aware. But very little focus in terms of planning and preparation on those big events, and the focus very much on the more likely things that are going to happen, but probably not quite as impactful in organisations. The other trend that we're typically seeing is that COVID-19 is the dominant issue. We've been dealing with it now since January and February. But the other thing to be very clear about is that it's not the only threat out there. And all the things that we were talking about and we were planning for prior to COVID, well, unfortunately, they're all still there. And we're now starting to see the impacts of some of those become more dominant in terms of events affecting organisations. So we then turn our attention to the current threat environment. What are the things that we're dealing with today? Well, we started the year off with a massive bushfire crisis that affected most parts of Australia. That bushfire crisis was unprecedented, and whilst it had very significant direct impacts on many communities, from an organisational perspective, I think it's important to think about the impact it had from an indirect perspective. Supply chain. Lots of organisations had difficulties getting their goods to markets, road closures, and various other impacts on supply chain. And also that the bushfire crisis, it started to change spending patterns. I think you'll probably agree that the retail period up until Christmas was a very poor period for many organisations because people stayed home. They didn't want to venture out with smoke logged skies and some of the road closures and the worries about the fires and so on. Now you'll see an image of Toll up there on the screen. That was very much around cyber. What we started to see through COVID in the early stages of COVID is an increase in the incidence and the frequency and the sophistication of cyber attack. Now, again, that was a massive threat leading into COVID. It was actually the #1 threat for most organisations, but we saw an uptick in terms of the types of impacts and also the frequency. So Toll's a prime example. In February, they got hit by a major ransomware attack. For any of you that rely on Toll, and many organisations around the country do, you probably suffered some very significant impacts to your supply chain because Toll's entire operations ground to a halt. Unfortunately for Toll, it wasn't just the first of the events that they were impacted by, and I believe they've now been hit by 4 cyber attacks over the course of the year. But we've seen many other examples. I don't think I need to say too much about COVID, other than to say that COVID was predictable. From our perspective, our role is all about helping organisations prepare for the worst, and we started running scenarios back in mid-January about what COVID could do. What were the scenarios, the likely outcomes? And it was pretty clear that the worst case scenario was a very probable event, which was for the pandemic to escape China. And we started briefing our clients, preparing our clients, talking to executive teams about what it might mean for them. Retail groups saying, look, you need to prepare for the shutdown of your shopping centres, telecommunications, supply chain, and so on. And of course, what we saw with COVID in early March is that worst case scenario starting to eventuate. And to cap it all off, of course, we've got into a La Nina weather pattern, and what that signifies are things like more frequent cyclones, more frequent storm events, flooding, and the Weather Bureau has now officially determined that we are in a La Nina weather pattern. Now, is it going to be as bad as 2011 or some of the previous ones? Probably not. The models are saying that it may not be as severe, but even without that level of severity, and if you remember 2011 with the Brisbane floods, we are in for an increased rainfall and increased storm patterns. For those in Sydney, you would have experienced a fairly severe storm last night. So the predictions with La Nina is that we will probably peak towards the end of December, but we'll experience the effects of that all the way through till about April. And what we need to do there is be able to withstand increased disruption from flooding and storms and power outages and those kinds of things. So when we think about the threat environment, we're going to continue to have to deal with different types of events from all sorts of different sectors. And probably the other one, which is sort of bubbling in the background at the moment, of course, there are issues with China and the impacts that might have on exports or even supply chain as well. So we do live in an uncertain world. The environment is changing rapidly. And of course, what that requires us to do is to continue to be able to respond and recover effectively to the kinds of events that are thrown in front of us. What I'm going to do in a moment is talk about some of those key learnings that we got from the debriefs that we've conducted. Before doing that, though, I think it's important to recognise where we are with COVID-19. It's been a journey for everybody, and I'm sure you'll probably all be looking forward to a break over Christmas to switch off and recharge those batteries. And I know staff across organisations are very much looking forward to saying goodbye to 2020. What we did in sort of May, June time, as we sort of coming out of the initial first wave, is we started mapping out where we were on the cycle of COVID. What are the phases that we're likely to see with COVID, and where are we going to go as a country and as a society in terms of next steps? We started off going through what we call a response phase from January through till about Easter, and we all went into various forms of lockdown through March. That response required organisations to very much then start to adapt to a socially distanced world, and that was the major impact for many organisations. Recovering from supply chain issues from China and those kinds of issues there. That response phase was then very much replaced by what we call a management phase. Now, management was really about, well, we're in our lockdowns now, what are we going to do next? And the focus there was really about stabilising business, getting into a temporary business as usual state, being able to operate our organisations, manage our staff and support our clients and other stakeholders, whilst we're in a very uncertain phase, but we're not expecting further lockdowns. And of course, there's an overlap between response and management. Now, in June, July, we were starting to move into a recovery phase. And of course, what we saw there is the second wave in Victoria. And that really set Victoria back into a response phase again. The rest of the country started moving into some form of recovery, and there's an overlap between management and recovery. But I think it's really important to recognise that recovery, which we're still very much starting to emerge or move into, is not going to be a linear path. It's going to be a path that's different for every organisation, every sector and every geographic location. But what we are seeing today, which is a very positive step, is that the whole country now is starting to move into a more predictable recovery with very low or non-existent COVID numbers, and other than South Australia, moving towards what we call elimination, which New Zealand's been in for quite some time. But I think the reality of the situation, and when we talk to our experts, is very much that even if we don't have COVID cases for 30 days or 50 days or beyond, at any point in time, we might see a resurgence. We might see clusters, and we have to be prepared for those clusters, and a wind back of some of our freedoms that we're starting to see there. So the concept of COVID normal, that is something that we will see and that we'll operate in. but it's going to be a little bit different to what the normal state was prior to COVID, and we're still obviously seeing what that might look like going into 2021. So what I'd like to do now is move into the debriefs and focus on some key areas. Debriefing is so important. Debriefing should be done at each of the phases of a change in a major event. And because this is very much an extended timescale, doing a debrief through the response phase, the management phase, is so important for organisations to gain learnings before they're lost, to be able to strengthen how you respond and recover to future events. So what I'm going to cover off now is the first focus area, which is response planning. What do we mean by response planning? Well, that's about the tools that you've got in place, the plans that you've got in place to be able to respond to these kinds of events, particularly COVID. Now, we saw two groups leading into COVID-19. We had organisations that had invested the time and the funds into creating plans, up-to-date plans that had been tested, and they were ready to respond to major events. Now, those organisations were still challenged by COVID-19, by all means. It was still a very, very difficult situation for them. But what they had is a roadmap to follow, a path to follow, action plans to implement, and they got predictable results despite the challenges. The other camp were those that hadn't prepared themselves to respond to events, whether it's COVID or a cyber attack or a severe weather event or a security incident like terrorism. And for many of those organisations, they really had to fumble through and rely on the individual experience of people, of senior leaders to guide them through. And of course, rely on a dose of luck in many cases as well. So the types of plans we're talking about here are crisis plans, crisis management plans, business continuity plans, and pandemic plans. So it's important to recognise that COVID-19, particularly for those that had business continuity plans, what COVID-19 did though is it tested our ability to implement remote working, and that was very important. But because we had plenty of time to respond, it didn't really test our ability to respond quickly to situations. So when it comes to planning, the key takeout is having a toolkit that provides guidance. That toolkit needs to be relevant, it needs to be action-oriented, it needs to be current, and it needs to be practiced. And we very much saw that those organisations that had invested the time and energy into doing so were able to have those more predictable outcomes. Now, what we're going to do is run a poll. So, David, I might hand back over to you.
Thanks, Dan. So, our first poll question in regards to the response planning is: exercising the use of plans and practicing how to respond during a major incident is a critical ingredient in minimising impact from an event. So the question: have you participated in an exercise in the past 12 months? We'll just give that another 10 seconds or so, Dan, and then we can talk to those results.
And these polls are anonymous, so I certainly encourage everybody to respond. If you have been involved in any type of exercising or practice of how you operate as a leadership team or an operational management team, but if you haven't, then you could answer on that as well.
Okay, it looks like we're probably there, Dan.
Okay, so what were our results looking like there, Doug?
So at the moment, we're saying 54% have said yes, they have participated in an exercise in the past 12 months. 46% said no, so we're 50-50 nearly.
Okay, that's interesting. And that's really consistent with a lot of what we've seen through the debriefing. One of the things that I certainly recommend to organisations, though, is that COVID has obviously been going for a sustained period of time, and a lot of organisations really put on hold things like preparation for cyber attack and other types of incidents. Very understanding, given that the focus had to be really about stabilising your own organisations. But those threats are still there, and if there is time and headspace and appetite, start looking at some of those other types of events and asking yourself, are we prepared for them? Can we cope with them? Do we have the right planning and knowledge and awareness and capability to deal with those? Right, we might move on to focus area number 2 then, and that is what we're calling critical business functions. What do we mean by that? Well, critical business functions are an outcome of doing business continuity planning. Hopefully you've all got business continuity plans in place, but part of having an effective business continuity plan or recovery capability is understanding what functions of your business are critical and which ones can be put to the side if you suffer a major incident. So business continuity planning kicks in when you've had a major incident and parts of your organisation have been disrupted. It could be supply chain, it might be your customer functions, it might be your call centre functions, it might be your back office like finance or some of your operational areas. But understanding which parts of your organisation are going to cause you the most loss or damage is so important, because when we do suffer a major incident, we can't get everything back at the same time. And what we need to do is prioritise our time, resource and energy and focus on those areas that are going to cause us the greatest impact. It could be impact to people, it might be impact to your brand, it might be your operational capabilities or supply chain, it might be financial impact, it might be legal impact, it might be long-term strategic impact. So understanding which of your business functions are going to cause the most loss or damage enables you to prioritise your planning and make sure that you put things in place before an incident takes or occurs to be able to minimise that loss or damage. So when it came to the debriefing, what we found, and I don't think this is really any surprise, is that those organisations that had invested in their business continuity programs pre-COVID, their ability to instigate remote working was far more effective than those that didn't. They knew which functions were most important. They'd already established redundancies and the ability to have workarounds. They'd already established the or invested in the awareness of staff on how to do that. So what we saw there is those organisations implementing plans during the early stages of COVID, rather than having to develop those plans and work out how to do it. One of the most obvious examples of that is in remote working, we need to have the ability for people to log into our systems in a remote capacity, VPN access, or the capacity to be able to do that. And in many organisations that hadn't planned for this, they didn't have enough bandwidth or capacity to enable all of their staff to be able to log in a secure fashion at the same time. Now, what we're seeing today, though, is a change. We've gone back into, we're in a recovery phase, so we've gone back to partially working back in offices. Many organisations are now doing that, and I think you'll see in the new calendar year a lot more organisations going back into an office environment. But we're also allowing staff to work from home. So what we've got today is a hybrid model of mass remote working and using offices. Now, when we went into a remote working environment, what that did is it implement or introduce some weaknesses into our organisations, our recovery capabilities. A call centre with everybody sitting in a single building or multiple, two sites, had reliability in terms of systems, in terms of power, and various other aspects. But when we send everybody home to do that from their own homes, in one sense, we've dispersed our risk, but then if we have a major storm that comes through and takes power out, then we've introduced additional weakness into our recovery capabilities or our operations. Cyber was another major issue that we saw starting to impact organisations. With everybody working from home, using their home internet, and possibly their home computers, we saw organisations starting to be impacted by increased levels of cyber attack, and of course that was a major concern there. So we are in a hybrid model now. We do have additional factors in terms of the stability of our operations, and the takeaway from these debriefs is that it's really important to look at where your vulnerabilities now lie. Where are your single points of failure? Where are you exposed in terms of your operations with people working from home or working for the office, or looking at both of those? Another really important area is supply chain. Where is your supply chain exposed at this point in time, given the circumstances? We do have another poll, so I might get you to try that up, David.
Sure, no problems. Thanks, Dan. So our poll question number 2, in the early stages of COVID-19, Australia suffered major supply chain disruptions due to the close down of China. How were you impacted by these issues? So I encourage everyone to answer this one, because this will give us some really good data points to talk to as we go through this webinar.
And then to put into context, organisations that were heavily reliant on China for their supply chain, that had minimal inventory in Australia through January, February, and into early March, probably experienced some fairly substantial impacts. Those supply chain impacts changed and moved more over to Europe as China opened back up again, and Europe started to be affected. Now we're starting to see some different effects from supply chain issues. One of the big concerns from medical authorities now leading into 2021 is the impact of vaccine distribution on supply chain. Now, there's a number of, both the two top contenders in terms of vaccines, which are currently going through emergency approval in Europe and the US, both require cold storage. So anybody that relies on cold storage today, the expectation is that those supply chains will be heavily impacted by the rush to get a vaccine out in 2021.
Okay, we'll just maybe give another 5 or 10 seconds on the voting. Okay, so interestingly, down the group here are saying that about 70% were minimal impact from supply chains with the China shutdown, and about 29-30% had moderate impact.
Okay. And hopefully that's an indication that you do have multiple source suppliers, or you've got resilience built into those supply chains that support you going forward. So what we might do now is move into focus area number 3 from the debrief, and that is very much around the crisis management structure. So what we were looking at there is the effectiveness of leadership teams to respond to COVID-19 in a crisis management capacity. Now, why is this important? Well, COVID-19 was clearly an event that sits outside of business as usual. It requires us to operate and manage in a way that is different to the way we normally do, because of those impacts on people, operations, supply chain, the financial impacts, the brand impacts, and so on. What we know quite clearly is that we need a very specific structured crisis response, because it supports the ability to make faster decision making. It makes sure we can use information more effectively. And some of the requirements that typically lead to better outcomes is having clearly defined leadership roles and responsibilities that are specific to crisis management or event management, having very clear decision-making procedures that allow you to particularly circumvent some of the normal standard approaches to decision-making, allows you to make faster decisions in a more secure environment there. Having those simple, effective crisis tools, having effective communications, and those communication requirements, which we'll cover off shortly, are typically far more heavy duty than a business as usual environment. And of course, timeliness of response, being able to move quickly. These are really important things that we want to see to have an effective response. Lack of a formal crisis management team structure and appropriate capability, what we saw through COVID-19 very much impacted organisations' ability to make fast decisions and effective decisions. Again, coming back to a point I made earlier on, what we really saw there for organisations that didn't have that structured capability, those defined roles, responsibilities, and so on, very much relying on individuals. And given the scale of the event, the time that it went over, those individuals could only provide limited capability for a limited amount of time before they became fatigued, ineffective, before the crisis or leadership structure really started to become ineffective and break down. So really, I guess, emphasise the importance of having some structure around how you lead through a major event, and your staff and other stakeholders very much need that structured leadership in terms of giving them the certainty and predictability in terms of how the organisation is going to respond there. Now, one of the things that we're very much seeing around COVID-19 is it's not over by any means. We're definitely in a great place here in Australia compared to overseas, and some of you will have overseas offices or teams who are probably going through much greater impacts than we are ourselves. But COVID-19 is here with us for at least the next 12 to 18 months. The expectation from a vaccine is that even if we start to see emergency approvals over the coming weeks, the general population will start to receive vaccines mid-year. and it will take 6 months to populate or to vaccinate the population. So we are going to be living in some sort of COVID world over the next 12 to 18 months. We will see clusters break out, and we've got to be able to prepare for those kinds of things, the health, the workforce, the supply chain impacts that come from them. And at the same time, we have to be able to deal with some of those other events that we've just been talking about, La Nina impacts, cyber attacks. We're starting to see an uptick again in terms of terrorism-related events. We know quite categorically that the major threat to Australia is actually not Islamic terrorism or fundamentalism. It is the far right or the alt-right. That is what ASIO and the other security authorities are worried about here in Australia and New Zealand. So what we've got to be able to do when it comes to our crisis management structure is we've got to be able to have depth. We've got to have the capability to be able to lead through multiple events. We've got to be able to manage concurrent crisis events. Having the toolkits to be able to do that, making sure we've got the depth of leadership capability to be able to lead through a new event that impacts you whilst we have what we call a COVID overlay, the impacts from COVID. So the takeout here is very much ask yourselves, look at your own leadership capabilities and structures and say, do we have the ability to lead through multiple events at the same time? Or are we going to collapse in a heap because we're already fatigued, we're already at breaking point, we've already exhausted those capabilities through the last 9 months of very challenging circumstances? All right, I believe we've got one final poll, David.
We do, yeah, thanks, Dan. So our final polling question. During this pandemic, we have seen the incidence of cyber attack increase significantly. If your organisation were to experience a major cyber attack now, do you believe that you and your organisation have the capability to respond to this as well as managing the ongoing impacts of COVID-19? So some interesting results coming in down. 50% saying, yep, we're well equipped, we're well prepared. 50% are unsure. We're not quite sure yet whether we're ready for it and we have the capability to respond. And there's a small percentage who are saying no, we're not ready. Okay.
Now, when it comes to cyber attack, whilst this is all about insights from COVID-19, look, cyber is one of those things we call a whole of business incident. If you do suffer a major cyber attack, this is not an IT issue. It's an issue that will have very far-reaching implications right across the business, whether it's operations or your brand, or a loss of data which creates privacy breaches and so on. The questions that we should really be asking is, how well prepared are our IT teams to form into a cyber incident response team? Do they have an effective escalation process that links into your overall organisational escalation to be able to recognise when a cyber attack really does threaten the overall organisation itself? Have we got the ability at a leadership level to understand what a cyber attack means and the types of things that need to be put in place there? Cyber is something which is very relevant, and as I said earlier on, really we're seeing an uptick in terms of the incidents and the sophistication of those. The final thing I'll say about cyber, of course, though, is the weakest link in any organisation are employees, and I've seen some interesting statistics lately with clients who have done what we call phishing campaigns, which is having emails sent out to the staff base by organisations like ourselves or cyber organisations to measure how many people click onto those random links or those suspect links or opening up documents. And we're seeing stats of sort of 30–40% of staff opening up these phishing emails at the moment, which should be very, very concerning because that really does expose you to threat there. All right, let's move on to focus area number 4. We've only got one more after that, and it's all about managing information. Why is that important? Well, in any major incident or crisis event, how you manage information really determines how well you can make decisions. It's all about building what we call situational awareness for a crisis team, and that's understanding what's happening now, but what could happen next. And if we use information well, if we collect it well, if we know what questions to ask, what information we know and what we don't know, we then have greater visibility about what the next potential evolution or escalation point is for the situation, which allows us to build a blueprint for how we're going to try and minimise the impacts as a crisis team or a leadership team on the organisation itself. Now, through COVID-19, and I don't think there's any surprise, most organisations didn't have a robust system for managing information. And what we saw through COVID is so many different sources of information coming in from so many different areas, lots of teams operating and all collecting their own information, and being able to track and disseminate that information was quite challenging for organisations. It was the complexity that they really struggled with and where to go to get reliable information. And a simple example is that each state was reporting their own, each state health department had their own updates and advice. And then you had the federal government doing the same, and there wasn't always consistency amongst those. And then you had the World Health Organization and the CDC and Johns Hopkins University, and then you had all the news outlets reporting information as well. So knowing what to do, what information to rely on, how to share that information effectively is so important there. The other thing that we had to deal with through COVID-19 is the use of technology for information. So many people working from home, having to rely on Teams and Zoom and other platforms, and for many organisations really not being prepared for that and having to learn how to share information effectively through COVID-19 and being able to put practices in place that mean that people have a common picture of what's happening there. The issue that we do still face is that with the working from home, the reliance on virtual is that we are vulnerable to disruption, particularly power outage from storms, and that can disrupt your ability to share information very, very quickly. But from a leadership perspective, key takeout is, do you have effective information management capabilities in place? Do you have simple protocols around how to log information and share it and update people? And whenever you're managing a major incident, ask the question, what do we know? But also, what don't we know? And that should form the basis for you seeking new information to guide your decision making. So what I'd like to do now is just finish off on our final focus area, which is about communicating or managing communications. I think it's you'd probably all agree that communicating in any major incident is probably the most challenging piece. It's the hardest bit. It's the piece that involves the most time and resources. And of course, if we get it wrong, it can escalate a situation very, very quickly. So what do we see from organisations through COVID? Well, in the early stage of COVID, most organisations were actually very slow to respond and to recognise the gravity of the situation and what it could mean on their staff, their customers and other stakeholders. Most organisations were slow to start to recognise what they need to do for staff if they were a close contact of someone who was potentially infected with COVID. If they got a COVID infection in one of their premises or their sites, what do they do? That, of course, changed because there were massive demands as we started to send people home in terms of keeping teams productive, keeping them motivated, managing welfare issues. So those organisations that responded with that and released honest, transparent, frequent communication from leadership teams absolutely benefited the most. Organisations that had their CEO or C-suite doing weekly video conferencing with staff, having the ability for staff to ask questions in a transparent or an anonymous fashion so they didn't feel threatened, very much benefited in terms of staff welfare and productivity as well. People were scared, people were uncertain, and they didn't know what the future looked like, and they went to their organisations for guidance. Now, the important thing to identify in terms of COVID is where to next. As I mentioned before, COVID is not over. We're moving into 2021. What we have seen from many organisations is them starting to back off the pace, the frequency and the tone of their communications because, well, look, we're now in a COVID normal sense. We've beaten COVID. What is really important to recognise is that customers and staff and other stakeholders are very much still living in an uncertain world, still feeling the effects of COVID. And our staff, many of them are so fatigued and what they still need is support. We need to keep those communications going. We need frequent communications, but we need to change the tone and the messaging of that communications in terms of what the next phase of COVID looks like for your organisations. What are you doing now to facilitate recovery? How are you going to survive or prosper through the next phase of COVID? What opportunities are you taking advantage of that you can communicate back to staff to give them certainty So they're there for you and you're there for them. So communications, the key message here is COVID's not over. We don't need the same messaging as we had through May, June, July, August, but what we need to do now is to evolve and adapt our communications to the next phase of COVID. So these are 5 key areas with some really important insights for organisations in terms of what it looks like next. So what I would encourage people to do is to ask questions. We've got plenty of time for those questions, but Nick, I might hand over to you for a moment.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Dan. It's certainly very important and interesting insights there. I've got a few questions that have started to come in, so I'll start from the top. I understand that some businesses have created standalone pandemic plans. What is the purpose of these and how do they interact with our crisis plans?
Yeah, look, certainly. Now, pandemic planning was something which was really relevant sort of through February, March, April, when people were saying, well, how do we respond to this thing called a pandemic? Because we've never experienced one before, and what does it mean? So when I looked at the pandemic plan for organisations that did have them, almost every one of those pandemic plans had a date of 2009 on that plan. The reason? Because that was swine flu. That was when swine flu broke out, and swine flu at the time had a very, very real likelihood of becoming like Spanish flu in 1918. In other words, it was mapping in an almost identical fashion. The only thing it didn't do is evolve to become far more deadly. In fact, it became far less deadly, but it caused lots of heartache. So people built pandemic plans back in 2009, and anybody who's an APRA-regulated institution, it was a requirement to do that. And then they put them in the cupboard because swine flu went away, and they never got picked up again until this year. So what is a pandemic plan? A pandemic plan is to guide you through the evolving outbreak of a pandemic, because what it requires you is to implement a staged and proportionate response. A pandemic plan should sit alongside your crisis plan and your business continuity plan. It should be integrated and linked in terms of the escalation. But what it's designed to do is to help you make decisions around a whole of organisation or society or state-based response to an evolving threat, a health threat. They're needed, they're important. There comes a point in time, like we did once we enacted our lockdown, that you didn't need the pandemic plan, so it kind of went back on the shelf because we'd gone beyond the requirements of that plan. But if you don't have one in place, they are really, really important, because we are going to see other health threats. If you talk to any of the medical authorities in health state departments today, to be honest, COVID is the pandemic you wanted to have, because it has a fairly low mortality rate compared to some of the ones that are still bubbling away in the background, like MERS, 30% mortality rate, avian flu, 60% mortality rate. Pandemic plans are important, but they need to be very well linked in and integrated with your other planning tools. Okay,
thanks, Dan. The next question has come up, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this one. I was actually listening to a podcast that talked to this very issue just yesterday. What is the outlook for 2021, particularly with regards to how a vaccine will change things?
Yeah, look, certainly. Look, it's a crystal ball piece. We pull out the crystal ball and say, look, where's it going to go? I think the news that we've had over the last 2 weeks around the reporting of the vaccine results, the stage 3 trials, is exceptionally encouraging. Before that, John Hopkins, we have a partnership with John Hopkins University, so we get access to some very current medical information. There was concern that the Oxford University vaccine, which was the most progressed one, had a fairly low rate of protecting people, 60%. Now, it's been reported that it may be higher than that, but what we're seeing with the other 2 vaccine candidates at 90 to 95% is very, very encouraging. So what does that mean for us in reality? What it means is the environment that we're operating in here in Australia today is more than likely to be the COVID normal that we have to live with until the end of 2021, which means that we're going to have restrictions on us. Those restrictions will ease up until Christmas, but there will be, you'll have to sign in on premises. There will still be 1 person per 2 square metre rules in lots of venues. There'll still be caps on the number of people that can do things. There'll be mask wearing in public transport, and there will be clusters that break out, just like New Zealand had after 50 or 60 days of no infections at all. So we're going to be living with this, and I think it's really important to recognise that most organisations have less resilience to respond to new events because of the impacts of COVID on their balance sheets and their operations. So we're going to feel the effects of that, and of course we're going to start to see some of the stimulus come off. So I think for organisations, it's about making sure that concept of business as usual is stable, that we've looked at our vulnerabilities, that we've addressed them, that we've got the ability to respond quickly and make good decisions to mitigate the impacts of any of those other events through 2021 whilst we see the vaccine rollout. There will be a very, very strong and heavy focus on vaccination. There'll be lots of publicity. So I think that's going to take a lot of attention and airwaves through the second half of 2021, which will allow us then hopefully to go into some sort of reset as we go into 2022.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The next question up is, there is certainly COVID fatigue out there and everyone wants to move on. Given that COVID is still around, how do we keep our messaging and communications current and fresh? And can we just let it go like everyone else?
Well, look, I'll probably address some of that in the topic about communications. Look, you can let it go, but I think what you'll probably start to see is staff or the effects of the fatigue and the uncertainty on your workforce into 2021. Now, we saw this in Christchurch after the massacre that happened, in March of last year. Christchurch was a city that was still recovering from the earthquake, so they were vulnerable. And then when they had the massacre, we saw a delayed reaction, but very, very unusual reactions from people. Now, there's a concept that is really important that we teach to executives in crisis management, and that is about concurrent stress. Stress builds on stress. It's a known, proven fact that if you are already vulnerable, stressed, emotionally traumatized by a situation, and you're exposed to another one, then that is going to build on what you're already suffering through and is going to have greater effects on you. If we then extrapolate that out to the workforce, I think it's fair to say that we're going to start to see the manifestation of some of the negative impacts of COVID, decision-making that you may have had to make through your own organisation, people's own personal lives and financial stresses start to become evident. And you might start to see challenges around productivity. We may see people starting to resign and start to pursue other work opportunities. So your communications should really be designed around supporting staff, bringing optimism back into the organisation, painting a picture for what the future looks like for them. But I think we've got to be very realistic here that our workforce has been through a very, very challenging time, unprecedented, nothing like they've ever seen before. We have an opportunity now to reinforce the positive values and qualities of our organisations into 2021.
That's great. Some really good questions coming through now, so we'll continue on. Has COVID-19 seen BCPs and crisis plans completely rewritten, or were traditionally structured plans with a pandemic scenario simply proven and effective on an as-is basis?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. What we've seen is that most business continuity plans didn't include pandemic planning because it went beyond, the impacts go beyond what is a typical business continuity time frame for recovery, which is normally sort of 4 weeks. You can sort of plan on getting most things back up and running, but the impacts of a pandemic go far beyond. So what are we seeing? Well, the first thing we're seeing is that those that did have those plans in place and have done business impact analyses beforehand, they've had the ability to improve or improve the robustness of their recovery capabilities. So it's more that they've tweaked their plans, they've added bits to them, they've certainly added more around how do you respond to longer term events. The timescale for recovery has absolutely been extended from typically 0 to 4 weeks right out to 6 months or beyond. So they're some of the things we've seen with business continuity plans. They haven't been rewritten en masse. They've been tweaked and they've been modified to be more appropriate for the environment. Now, what I'd say is because COVID is not something that's going away quickly, the timescale is appropriate to do that. I wouldn't rewrite a business continuity plan for a one-off event, but I would certainly say that there is a need to make sure business continuity plans are fit for purpose for this environment. That is an extended, obviously, impact timescale there. I have also seen organisations that have tried to do business continuity on the cheap, got onto Google and tried to build a good business continuity plan from looking at some Google websites. And in most cases, those plans don't work. And there's been questions asked as to, well, why didn't we have effective business continuity in place?
Yep, that's great. I'll get you to put your economist hat on now, Dan. Do you have a view on the economic impact next year and also on the mental anguish and fraud side within business as a result of COVID?
Yeah, look, I think again, crystal ball, I think we've got some GDP numbers coming out today, which will tell us how we fared in the September quarter. And the economists are all looking at probably a return to growth, which is fantastic. But I think it's realistic to say that we're not out of the woods in terms of the economic impacts of COVID. The question will really be now, how well are organisations able to withstand future shocks in terms of their economic, their reserves. From an economic perspective, a broader economic perspective, I think you will see a fairly quick rebound. And I think what we've seen in the past few months when economies start to open up, that has proven that people are very keen to get back to what they were doing before. The unknown factor for us, though, I think going into 2021 is, will there be an impact from China and some of the challenges we're facing today? Worst case is there would be a substantial impact on GDP growth if we start to see further exports impacted by that. That is an unknown, and I think time will tell on that one. So for us, it is the recovery piece as a starting point. If we stay away from additional waves of infection, I think the recovery will start to get predictable, and we will see a faster bounce back. But we are seeing obviously some geopolitical impacts that may start to slow that down, and that's the unknown piece we have to be watchful of and we have to be prepared for. As I said before, when it comes to productivity, I do think that we have to be very conscious of the negative impacts of the last year on employees and how that could affect our productivity going forward.
Okay. Another one's just come through. Have you had any experience with a business with a major cyber outbreak specifically identified to their brand? Is it a brand death sentence?
Okay. Look, the answer to that is absolutely. In fact, I was due to run a major exercise for a national organisation, a very well-known brand, about 3 weeks ago, cyber exercise. And they got hit literally about 4 days before the exercise was due. It takes about 6 weeks to prepare for an exercise of that size, by a well-known, what we call an APT, which is a group that overseas group that is prevalent in that. Look, most cyber attacks have very real potential to impact brand. Particularly if there's any form of data loss, you have an obligation, particularly if it could cause serious harm, to notify customers and the markets and so on. So you have to be prepared for brand damage. Is it a death sentence? Absolutely not. If you are, firstly, if you're able to take measures early and you're prepared for cyber attack as best you can be, then you're able to respond faster. But what stakeholders, whether it's customers, the markets, are looking for is for you to respond promptly, to respond with clear actions in terms of how you're going to mitigate the effects, to be open and transparent about what's happened. And then to demonstrate that you're on top of what happens next. Toll, unfortunately for Toll, they were impacted by the cyber attack. It had massive impacts. They implemented measures to restore their operations. Some of those measures triggered further cyber attacks. They will come back from that, but of course they are going to suffer some significant brand damage because that really is worst case for them. So having a whole of organisation response capability, starting at the executive down, is so important from a cyber perspective. But open, transparent, prompt communications is critical in terms of how you're perceived in the market from that attack.
Dan, Nick, I was going to say, Dan, I know we're seeing some emerging trends from a board advisory level coming out of the market just now. Where business continuity and resilience was previously maybe a tick the box exercise. In light of COVID, how are you seeing those boards now address resilience differently? Yeah,
look, certainly. Look, the boards are now starting to ask questions, and rightly so, about how well prepared are we in terms of being able to respond to these kinds of situations. We've seen some very clear examples. Idle Leisure was probably the most visible one, and it's obviously a few years ago now, of the challenges when a board gets involved. So there are a couple of variables here. Industrial manslaughter laws are a starting point, which we're expanding across Australia, which makes directors personally liable from a criminal perspective. That is changing the landscape. But even without industrial manslaughter laws, boards have an obligation and a responsibility for their organisations in terms of that corporate governance. And I think there's an awakening in terms of what that really means in terms of things like cyber attack, even COVID and other types of events. Now, the critical piece that boards are asking is what are our role and what are our responsibilities during a major event? And we need to be really clear about where the board fits into this. And unfortunately for Ardent Leisure, there was a blurring of the lines between the board's responsibilities and the executive, which didn't produce positive outcomes. So from a board perspective, having confidence in what's in place and the capabilities of an organisation is the first point. The board understanding where they fit into the picture is number two, and the board getting involved in a limited capacity with some of the preparatory activities that the executive get involved in can be really important as well, because that will help the executive understand how to support the board and give them the information they need to be able to perform their roles.
Thanks, Dan. We've probably got time for one more question before we wrap things up. This is actually one of mine, Dan. We talk to our clients a lot about supply chain and supply chain resilience. What steps are companies now taking, particularly in light of COVID, to really look at their supply chain and actually asking their customers and more particularly their suppliers around what their resilience plans look like and how they can continue to either supply or receive goods? Yeah,
look, it's such an important question. Now, my first recommendation to everybody is risk assess your supply chain. Understand where your vulnerabilities are. Where are your single points of failure in the supply chain? Is it that you're using single source suppliers? Is it that the supply chain is extended over a very geographic areas which are vulnerable? Is it about inventory management? But risk assess the supply chain, be clear about those vulnerabilities and start to plan for how they could be disrupted. So that is, I guess, the starting point in terms of supply chain. Where does it go from here? What can you do? Well, look, I think when we look at those single points of failure there, we can put things in place that can mitigate it early and therefore reduce the impacts in terms of what that might look like.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks, Dan. We'll look to wrap things up now. Look, hopefully, everybody's got something out of today's session. I certainly have. In terms of the final messages, I'll leave you with a couple of things before I then hand across to Dan to wrap it up. Lots of things to take away. I guess one of the most important ones for me was really an organisation's ability to deal with concurrent events. Everybody, I guess, has been focused so much on COVID, and rightly so, over the last 9 to 10 months. But it doesn't mean that cyber attack goes away, or weather events will go away, or the geopolitical environment with China in particular will go away. So I think boards and organisations need to be able to deal with multiple events at once, not just one. That was certainly a big takeaway for me. I wouldn't be an insurance broker if I didn't put my insurance hat on for a couple of minutes. But insurers now are really focusing on organisations' resilience and business continuity plans. It wasn't really a discussion we had with underwriters, going back a year or two ago. Property insurers are now focusing on it, particularly for companies that might have a single site, manufacturing location or a large distribution centre that is really, I guess, critical to their business. Insurers are wanting to know what resilience and what redundancies does the business have in place. And also directors and officers liability. It's a massive issue at the moment in terms of underwriters wanting to understand how organisations have been impacted and how they're reacting to COVID. What does their balance sheet look like? What are they doing for resourcing and looking after their staff welfare? What are the government entitlements? Those sorts of things are all coming into play. What are the cash flows looking like over the next 6 to 12 months? And that's really for insurers not to look at giving you a great deal from a premium perspective, but just to be able to get a ticket to the game, really, for the insurers to consider whether or not they'll write your risk. So it's got wide implications. It's not just a risk and a business issue. It's now filtering into the insurance market as well. So there are, I guess, a couple of key messages from me. Thanks to Dan and Dave and the team at RiskLogic for hosting the webinar. It's certainly been fantastic this morning. I'll hand across to Dan to wrap things up.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, everybody, thank you very much for your time today. Just a couple of final messages. Look, I think the need for both personal and organisational resilience has never been higher. I think that's a fairly obvious statement to make. The potential for organisations to be impacted and have those negative consequences is very real today, and again more so than we've seen in modern times there. The key takeaway though is that you can't prepare for a major incident during that incident itself. It's what you do before it affects you that enables you to get the best outcomes. So have a look at what's in place today, what's working, what's not working, how well prepared you are from a leadership perspective, how well that is integrated into your operational response and recovery capabilities. Ask the tough questions so you can take measures before something else affects your organisation, and that will help you minimise impacts. So thank you very much for your time today, and hopefully that's been a useful insight into some of the lessons from COVID.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.